السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. هي هدى كاتبي، مدونة وناشطة إيرانية-أميركية تركز في عملها على حقوق عمال الملابس والإنتاج الأخلاقي للأزياء والهوية الإسلامية والأزياء في إيران ومكافحة برامج المراقبة والعسكرة. ولعل بعض المقربين منها يلمحون إلى خفة حركتها مع السخرية الممزوجة بالفطنة والذكاء عند وصف أداء كاتبي على الشاشة. وبحسب هؤلاء تنبع سخرية كاتبي من كونها تمثل مادة جدل باستمرار، ولا سيما في وسائل الإعلام الأمريكية الرئيسية، حيث يتم التركيز دوما عند الحديث عنها أو معها على مواضيع تتعلق بإيران وارتدائها الحجاب أو بكونها امرأة مسلمة. وحقيقة أن هدى نفسها عندما تشرح تلك الأمور تربطها بالقضايا العالمية مثل معاداة السود ونضالات السكان الأصليين، ومع ذلك من الواضح أنه في بعض الأحيان لا يتمكن الناس من تجاوز السطح والغوص معها في تفاصيل الأمور التي غالبا ما تثير الجدل. في المقابل، لعل في الأوساط الأكاديمية بدأ جوهر كتابات كاتبي ونشاطها يستحوذان على اهتمام المتابعين، إذ لديها رؤية شاملة حقا للصلات بين الدين والأعراق والاستشراق والاستعمار. هي شابة يافعة جريئة ومفعمة بالشجاعة وحادة كالسيف ذكاء، ترتكز في أعمالها على التقاطعات بين العمل والرأسمالية والأجناس والحالة الجسدية والعنف ضد المسلمين والعسكرة العالمية، القضايا التي حازت من أجلها على جائزة قادة لشيكاغو جديدة من مؤسسة فيلد، وأيضا على جائزة بايونير من مؤسسة شيكاغو للمرأة. هدى كاتبي هي مؤلفة كتاب طهران ستريت ستايل عن الأزياء في إيران وسواها، ومدونة منصة جوجو أزاد، ومطلقة نادي الكتاب العالمي الثوري تحت وسم لأننا قرأنا. يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من شيكاغو هدى كاتبي لنتعرف أكثر على أصالة هذه الثائرة والتحديات التي واجهتها وما زالت، وصمودها وتطلعاتها وكونها شخصية ذات طابع تغييري في الشباب. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Huda Katibi, Iranian-American political fashion blogger, writer, entrepreneur, and abolitionist organizer and creative educator. Welcome to الداخل from the inside, Huda.
Salam, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Thanks for being here. Pure pleasure to have you always. Well, to start, Huda, as an Iranian-American raised in Oklahoma, which is homogeneously white and a conservative state, you and many Muslims in the US of A today face a lot of backlash. What do some of these challenges look like, Huda?
Definitely. Thank you for the question. Yeah, Oklahoma is a very fun state. For those of you who don't know, and I'm talking probably mostly to the American audience because Americans don't know their own geography, Oklahoma is right above Texas in the southern part of the United States, and is very racist, very white, and very conservative. And so growing up, I had a lot of challenges trying to figure out what it exactly means to be Muslim. I didn't really have friends who looked like me. And I think as I grew older and started organizing and meeting other people, I realized that it's not just an individual racist, you know, that like punches you in the face or calls you a terrorist, but the issue of anti-Muslim racism, as I think is more aptly called in the United States, is really holistic. It is a form of racism because, of course, Muslims aren't a race. There's a sort of racialization of Islam and Muslims in the United States. So even like Christian people from Lebanon have been shot and killed actually in the United States because people think that they're Muslim. And so I think what's really important is to recognize that the United States in terms of media, in terms of academia, the way that knowledge is produced and dispelled, as well as structurally, the companies that are profiting, the companies that are invested in. It is a system of anti-Muslim racism, and under the guise of like this war on terror. And so after this war has sort of been created and really, really intensified and exacerbated in US society, what's important to recognize is that it also is global. It's not just the United States that uses war on terror language to criminalize Muslims, and especially along not just any Muslim, but we see the exacerbation of state violence against race, class, and gender lines. So, for example, Black visible Muslims in the United States face both anti-Muslim racism as well as anti-Black racism. Women who wear the hijab, who are very visible, face both different kinds of racism and violence at the hands of the state and surveillance. And what's also, I think, really important as for an international audience to recognize is that these companies are actually sharing data globally. And something that I like to say is that, unfortunately, like many of our minds are so limited when it comes to this idea of border. We can only, or some of us, can't even imagine a world without borders, a world where we can see how interconnected we are, how we can collaborate across borders transnationally. And yet these corporations, that's their reality. Corporations that work in surveillance, corporations that work in arms, corporations that work in any sort of violent entity or surveillance. States, Israel, India, China, and so many other countries, both using this shared data globally across borders, as well as the language of the war on terror. And many of our own countries in the Middle East use a lot of the same war on terror language to also describe people who are either validly or not using or expressing political dissent against the state too. So I think it's both something that the United States has really birthed and accelerated and profits from, but I think so many of our countries are actually complicit as well in the war on terror logic.
Allow me to, since you mentioned the issue of being an Iranian, you said once that those who are separated from their source yearn to go back. You have been to Iran and you did a research on the underground clothing fashions in the Islamic Republic, which you have documented in your book, Tehran Street Style. Tell us more about your findings and how much is there a media misrepresentation when it comes to hijab and women with headscarves as far as Islamic Republic in Iran is concerned?
Yeah, that's a great question and a huge question.
It is.
I think a lot of my interest in this research project came from just absorbing US media, seeing that we see the more and more, like all of these new media articles saying, oh, like people wearing jeans are somehow defying the mullahs of Iran, just very like Orientalist portrayals. And when I mean Orientalist, it's, the theory that Edward Said pushed out about how the ways in which the West understands the East is through a very particular lens that is very antithetical to how the United States creates its own identity. So everything that they, sort of ancient anthropologists documented, oh, Muslims are backwards, they don't know X, Y, Z, they're oppressed, all of these sorts of tropes. Those are still the ways that all of the East is really read, whether or not you're Muslim. And that's when we go sort of back to that conversation about the racialization of Islam and Muslims, is that the ways in which we learn about Iran, the way I learned about Iran growing up, was very much this idea that if you wear a miniskirt, you're free, and if you wear a hijab, you're oppressed. And this is a very, very basic binary that we should be well past by now. Because I think that women's liberation is far deeper than just how a woman dresses. I think what's specifically about Iran, I think what gets complicated is that things can be both repressive and also not the way that the United States puts it. So just like France bans hijabs in schools as a way to control women's bodies and therefore access to public space, Iran does the same thing, and both should be condemned. Any country that mandates dressing or undressing of women's bodies inherently is patriarchal and controls women. And I think that we see this so much when it comes to fashion and the way that it actually is inherently political. So everything we dress ourselves and step outside, it's a political decision. Whether or not like we have the privilege of having to think about that, that's one thing. But whether it's political, that's another. And so I think we see historically where women's bodies are a place where political tensions are mapped out and states are defined and nations are created. So I think fashion is a really powerful anthropological tool to understand women's histories in countries where maybe the archive is lacking, but also a way to really understand how people are feeling and expressing themselves, specifically in a country that has a mandatory dress code. So I think that for me was really revealing is that it's very complicated.
Yes, it is.
Who dresses, who wears jeans, that doesn't mean that they have a political preference one way or the other. And despite restrictions, Iranian underground designers are incredibly creative and make so many different clothes that I think is a reflection of the society that they're trying to push, and one that is very different than what the United States or what we see here. So I do think that, of course, it's complicated. I don't believe there should be a mandatory hijab, just like I don't believe there should be mandatory unveiling. And I also think that there are a lot of reasons why the United States is pushing specific narratives of oppression, as more being Muslim, the more oppressed you are, and the more you wear miniskirts, the more free you are, because it justifies also their more imperialist and political motives. But I don't think that realities of women on the ground in Iran also.
Allow me here to ask you, Huda, what does the US even want Iran to do in order to lift the coercive measures and the maximum pressure sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, super quickly, there are no realistic measures that the United States is actually requiring from Iran to lift sanctions, because they should have already been lifted. According to the 2015 Iran deal, Trump was supposed to lift sanctions after Iran complied with their side of the deal. They did. And instead, Trump does what every president does and breaks promises, breaks deals. So Trump pulled out of the deal and actually added worse sanctions, added maximum pressure sanctions that has completely destroyed sort of the lives of everyday Iranians. And I think that it's really, really significant if we want to understand what the United States really has as an aim for why sanctions are in place. Is we just got to look to the history of our neighbors and friends in Iraq, which role of sanctions in not only really destroying the infrastructure and destroying the lives of millions of people and being responsible for the death of 500,000 children in Iraq that continues to create intergenerational trauma. But the reason for why sanctions were instituted on Iraq changed from compliance to a set of demands to regime change. And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now, is that the United States wants to make the Iranian people so fed up about what's happening in the country that they have a revolution, or they have like a very, like a different form of change of state that the United States can have a hand in. And I think at the end of the day, as someone living in the United States that's Iranian and American, I recognize that my role is to be able to help fight to lift sanctions, not to help the Iranian government, but instead to help the Iranian people have the means to hold their own state accountable on their terms. So I think these are very, very different in the ways in which a lot of people, a lot of Iranians even in the United States, think that the role of sanctions is to actually prohibit Iran from getting funded of their military or things like that. But Iran's a welfare state, first and foremost. Everything we have about the people who are affected are always poor, working class Iranians, migrants, people who rely on the state for social services. And unlike the United States, Iran is a massive welfare state. So a lot of people rely on the Iranian government in order to get access to basic things like healthcare. So I think it's incredibly important that sanctions are lifted, not at all in a way of saying that the Iranian government is perfect and has no reason to be held accountable. But A, it's not America's job to hold countries accountable. And B, if Iranians are able to hold their government accountable, it should be on their terms with people who are living within the borders of Iran. And not people.
Exactly, Huda. Well said. Allow us to stop now for a short break, and then we will continue to talk about many more issues with Huda كاتبي, but after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم بكم من جديد هدى كاتبي, Iranian-American political fashion blogger, writer and entrepreneur. Welcome back to من الداخل هدى. Well, in early 2019, you launched Blue Tin Production, a worker cooperative run by working class women of color. It is an apparel manufacturing company for designers around the world. Can you tell us more about what the fast fashion industry is, what a worker cooperative is, and what some of the issues are that you're trying to tackle, please?
Yes, definitely. So I think to definitely start about what the fast fashion industry is, and I think we have to start from a place that is shocking to me every time I realize that people don't recognize that people make your clothes. Machines don't make your clothes. Every single thing that you're wearing right now, a person has touched and handled multiple times. And so it should really make you question, hopefully, why something like a t-shirt or even something more complicated than that can be so cheap when it goes through people who have grown cotton, harvested cotton, processed cotton, turn that into fabric, cut the fabric, sewed it. So many steps in creating just a simple t-shirt. And yet in the United States, for example, we can buy that for $5, which is nothing. My coffee costs that. So I think we really have to, and that's sort of where the root of the problem is that we've normalized this idea that clothes should be fast, incredibly cheap, and made in faraway places, from the United States, that is.
Sure.
And so fast fashion is really actually sort of a new phenomena. It's after the Industrial Revolution, so brands like Zara, H&M, Forever 21, Gap, all of these brands that you can check out their website and they have 10,000 new styles added daily. So in order to meet the production, and in order to increase profits and create more goods for people to buy, you have to create reasons for people to buy things, you have to create desire, and you have to have a new fashion schedule. So fashion at large runs on 4 seasons, right? Winter, fall, spring, summer.
Sure.
But the fashion industry relies on 52 seasons in the year. That's a new season every week, which means massive new styles and quantities every single week. And in order to meet those, it's primarily women of color, and majority Muslim women of color, and countries across Southeast Asia and East Asia, and really across the Middle East and Africa at large, who are forced to work in sweatshop conditions in order to make those clothes. So a lot of research that has been done by international human rights organizations, combing through that data, it's very clear to see that it is impossible to create fast fashion without relying on gender-based violence. And so a deep systemic issue within fast fashion that can't be resolved from donating 10% to charity or even creating sustainable clothes, because these are workers, this is labor, not sustainability. So
this is a very saddening reality, Huda.
Definitely, yeah. Unfortunately, it is the reality, and probably a majority of what we're wearing on our backs right now. And then I think another term that I want to sort of get into before talking about Blue Tin is this idea of abolition. So abolition in the United States really came from the movement to end slavery or to abolish slavery. And the idea in abolition is recognizing that specific systems and institutions rely on violence and they can't be reformed, right? No matter how much we push to reform, they still will always exist in a place of violence. We have to get rid of that institution. So abolition actually is just as much calling for the end of policing or prisons or slavery as it is imagining new ways of living and operating in the world, both in terms of our relationship to the state, but also to each other. So if that sort of perspective onto the fast fashion industry, like I mentioned, fast fashion requires gender-based violence. So the only way to actually address all of the millions of garment workers who are unpaid and faced with sexual violence, gender-based violence on the daily, is to end the system of fast fashion. Even if you pay garment workers, you decrease their hours, it's still going to require gender-based violence. It's not just
Huda. Yes, Huda, we commend you actually for this very humane aspect and approach towards fashion. This is very important to highlight, underscore. We commend you actually for those strides in fashion. Allow me here to ask you something also, which is one of your stars, so to say. In one of your interviews that went viral, you made the headlines through a very meaningful, intelligent comment, between quotations, because we've read. This comment sparked a global revolutionary, voracious reading movement. which is a virtual, of course, radical reading club under the hashtag Because We've Read. What is your objective through this reading club and how does it work?
Definitely. People don't read.
I agree, totally agree.
They just don't. They'll read a headline, and especially my generation and younger, I think.
And they claim that they know, actually.
It's a problem for sure. I mean, I do think that, again, people at those intersections, their experiences are knowledge, and we can also recognize that there's a lot that they know about the system without maybe having the language to describe it. But I think one quote in particular really sums up, I think, the goals of Because We've Read, and it's by Asada, who is currently in exile in Cuba. She's a Black Panther and was former on the #1 US terrorist list, but really, really incredible Black revolutionary writer, thinker, organizer. Highly recommend you look her up, Asada. But she has this quote that says that no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. No one is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes if they know that that knowledge will help set you free. And I think that's incredibly powerful. In the United States and everywhere in the world, the state will always give us in our education programs, on the TV, everywhere that we're consuming media, a very specific narrative that justifies and validates everything that the state is doing, why the conditions are as bad as they are. But if we actually want to be able to fight for global revolution and liberation that's on our terms and that actually helps our people, we have to understand and we have to read people who are silenced. We have to listen to the voices of garment workers who are systemically silenced. We have to listen to the people.
To the voices of the unheard.
Exactly. The people who don't get a place. Where are the Black and Afro-Lebanese voices in society? Where are the working class women in Lebanese society? Where are their voices? And so I think if we can really think about whose voices we are hearing and whose we're not, I think that allows us to really shift our narratives and understandings of what the state said it's doing, what the elite say that they're doing, and really helps us figure out those tools of being able to push forward.
Sure, and to be able to control the narrative at the end of the day.
100%.
Right, well, we can talk endlessly, Huda. You have many sparkling ideas, but I'm afraid time has run short. Iranian-American political fashion blogger Huda Katibé, writer and entrepreneur, thank you very much for your pristine ingenuity and voicing out who you are, no matter what.
شكرا كثيرا. Thank you so much for
أهلا
having me.
وسهلا, always a pleasure to have you. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.